Dan Tehan is the Liberal MP for Wannon in Victoria. He's also chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is finalising a report in the government's proposed metadata laws that would oblige telecommunications companies to retain metadata on phone and computer communications for at least 2 years. Dan Tehan, welcome.
Morning, Chris.
Now, I think we should point out straight from the top that the deliberations of the committee are in privilege, so both you and I will be in trouble if we start revealing the committee's findings.
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah.
However, we can talk about the general principles.
Yeah.
The Shadow Communications Minister, Jason Clare, who also sits on the committee, has said that there is still there's still concerns about the clarity of the definition of metadata. Is that still an issue?
Well, look, this is something obviously the committee is looking at, and something that I'm sure we will be discussing. I think the clearest definition on this area is what it isn't, and that is that it isn't content. And I think that's probably the simplest way to define it. And the government has made it very clear that it doesn't want to be looking at content. So look, this will be something that the committee will be looking at, will be examining as part of the whole process. But I think if you look at the legislation makes it pretty clear that we're not looking at content. So I think that's the easiest way to explain it.
Just for the benefit of viewers, can you give a kind of concrete example of how metadata retained for 2 years, that maybe 18 months down the track authorities may actually use that metadata? Give us a practical example.
A practical example? Well, a practical example, and there's one which has been made public, is to do with child exploitation and the use of the internet by paedophile rings. And what the agencies are able to do is to have a look and see, okay, where some connections might have been made between various people, and then they can use that. So they can use that then to see whether, okay, do they then need to want to get a warrant and potentially look at what was being examined. So that's the type of thing. I mean, the Inspector General of ASIO, the former Inspector General of ASIO, David Irvine, sort of looked at it as though it's a way of the police getting access to the phone book and then being able to see who has been making calls using, in past history.
So, for example, the Federal Police gets a tip-off from Interpol or someone. Look, there's this website that is peddling child porn. The authorities then can go back and see what ISP, what computers have actually connected to that website and start their investigation.
Yeah, they can look at the broad parameters. So they're just looking at the linkages more so than the actual content, and that then gives them an ability to say, okay, well, look, it looks like a connection was made here, therefore do we want to examine it further? And that's when they might go down the warrant-based process.
Okay, now the Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, has made the point that he's raised the concerns that the definition of metadata, what could be caught in this kind of web, if you like, is at the discretion of the Attorney General, and his concern is that maybe not this Attorney General, but in the future there'd be a creeping expansion of what's included in that net, and so he's saying it should be included in the legislation. That's a reasonable point, is it?
Well, look, this is obviously once again something that the committee will have to consider. We've received public evidence along those lines where people have argued that it should be included in the legislation, but that will be very much up for committee deliberation. So obviously various groups have made a public case for that, but this will be something, once again, that will need to be discussed.
Putting aside whatever the committee may think of that and whatever recommendations the committee might make, that may be a reasonable compromise for the government to consider if that's the price that Labor demands to support the legislation.
Yeah, well, look, as chair, I obviously have to balance the competing interests, and what I hope to be able to do is to get a broad consensus of the best way to go forward in a bipartisan manner. So obviously, this is something which has been raised, and we will have to have a serious look at this.
Now, if this metadata is there and authorities are accessing, what kind of guarantees can be given that, say, people like journalists contacting sources aren't caught up, lawyers who have privileged communications with their clients, indeed politicians investigating some of these issues or getting their staff to research issues? How can we prevent them being caught inadvertently, if you like, caught up in these sort of investigations?
Yeah, you've been very well briefed, Chris. This is another issue which obviously the public hearing has raised issues with regards to this on behalf of journalists and other organisations. And once again, like the committee has with the previous two pieces of legislation, this will be an area that we will look at extremely closely and see, OK, how can some of these concerns that have been raised being dealt with. Obviously, we had issues around the first major bit of national security legislation from last year, which was to do with special intelligence operations and how we would deal with the media there. The second major piece of legislation to do with foreign fighters also raised some issues around reporting. So this is one of the key considerations, I think, that the committee will need to deliberate on and to come up with something that hopefully we can have a bipartisan approach going forward.
Okay, just finally, the report tabled, made public at the end of the month. What's the process after that? So
the report will be delivered to the Parliament at the end of the month, and then what happens from then is that the government will then look at its recommendations and decide what, if any of the recommendations, it will take on board, and then the legislation will be put to the Parliament, I think most likely sometime in March. The history of the committee in the last year or so has been a very positive one. All our recommendations in the two previous major pieces of legislation have been accepted by the government, and that has meant that we've had bipartisan support of those two pieces of legislation going through the House and, most importantly, in this Parliament, the Senate. So my hope again is that we can reach a very good outcome on this piece of legislation, which improves it and puts in the additional safeguards that the committee thinks necessary, and then obviously up to the Parliament then to decide whether we'll support it or not.
Okay, Dan Team, thanks for your time today. Look forward to having you back when the report is made public and we can go through it.
Thanks, Chris. That'll be it'll be a little easier to discuss. So, but I appreciate the discussion today. Thanks.